They were supposed to walk on the moon, to leave footprints in lunar dust and speak to Earth from a land no human had touched. But just hours into the journey, a quiet murmur became a desperate cry. In the silent vastness of space, 3 men drifted farther from home than anyone before them, carrying hope, fear, and the fragile thread of survival. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's somewhat comforting to imagine all of us, scattered across the globe, quietly unwinding together. So, breathe deeply, settle in, and allow the mysteries of time and space to cradle your imagination. For in the quiet hours of the night, under the same stars watched by our ancestors, the secrets of long-lost struggles and soaring human courage await, patiently, quietly, like ancient starlight still reaching us from far across the heavens. Let's begin. It began, as most great journeys do, in quiet preparation, long before the thunder of engines or the silence of space. The year was 1970. At NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, engineers and astronauts were making final preparations for what was to be the 3rd mission to land men on the moon. The Apollo 13 crew trained diligently, reviewing procedures, simulating emergencies, and memorizing every switch, every dial, every line of the thick flight manual. To the public, it was another routine mission. But for those involved, there was no such thing as routine when it came to leaving the Earth behind. The commander of the mission was Jim Lovell, a calm, experienced astronaut who had flown 3 times before. He had orbited the moon on Apollo 8, and now he was slated to walk on its surface. He was joined by Fred Haise, the lunar module pilot, thoughtful and methodical, preparing for his first flight to space. The 3rd member, command module pilot Jack Swigert, was a late addition to the crew, replacing Ken Mattingly just days before launch, after Mattingly was exposed to German measles. Despite the change, the crew quickly adapted. They were professionals, bonded by trust and training. The spacecraft consisted of 3 parts: the command module Odyssey, the lunar module Aquarius, and the service module, which housed the propulsion and life support systems. Together, they stood atop the towering Saturn V rocket, a vehicle taller than a 35-story building and powerful enough to launch men beyond Earth's gravity. Engineers combed over every inch of the spacecraft, checking systems, reviewing logs, and verifying every component. But unknown to them, deep within the service module, a small flaw had already taken root, one that would reveal itself only after liftoff. As launch day approached, the team moved into quarantine. It was standard procedure, meant to protect them from illness before flight. They rested in sterile rooms, ate carefully prepared meals, and spent time with mission support running final simulations. On April 11th, 1970, at Cape Canaveral, the sun rose over a still Florida morning. A warm breeze drifted through the palm trees. The Atlantic shimmered quietly, and birds circled high above the launch site. The countdown had begun. At Launch Complex 39A, the Saturn V stood motionless, a white spire wrapped in scaffolding and steam. Fuel lines hissed, valves clicked, and final checks echoed through radios. The astronauts suited up in white pressure suits, each movement calm and practiced. Lovell, Swigert, and Haise rode the elevator up the gantry, pausing briefly at the top before climbing into the command module. The hatch was sealed behind them. Outside, thousands of spectators gathered on beaches and balconies to watch. Television cameras rolled. Engineers filled mission control in Houston, seated in neat rows beneath glowing monitors. At 2:13 p.m. Eastern Time, the engines of the Saturn V ignited in a towering bloom of fire and smoke. The rocket lifted slowly from the pad, straining against gravity with a deep thunderous growl that rolled across the coast. It climbed higher, accelerating, pushing through clouds and into the upper atmosphere. Staging occurred as planned. The first stage fell away, then the second. The final engine burn carried them into Earth's orbit. From the small windows of the command module, the astronauts saw the world shrink away. Blue oceans, swirling white clouds, and continents like scattered puzzle pieces drifted beneath them. The ship orbited the Earth once, then fired its engine again to begin the long journey to the Moon. Their trajectory was locked. The Earth began to fade behind them. The crew settled into routine. Lovell reported back to Houston with updates on spacecraft systems. Swigert ran checks on the navigation equipment. Haise verified the status of the lunar module. Everything seemed normal. The mission was on track. The mood on board was light. They joked, shared meals, floated through the cabin with the easy grace of zero gravity. Earthbound worries melted away as they passed deeper into the vacuum of space. In Houston, engineers monitored every system from afar. On their glowing screens, telemetry streamed in: cabin pressure, fuel cell voltage, oxygen tank levels. Rows of green indicators meant all was well. The flight director, Gene Kranz, paced between stations, nodding silently as updates were called out. There was a quiet confidence in the room. Apollo 11 had landed. Apollo 12 had refined. Apollo 13 would continue the story. Another flag, another step, another moment in humanity's journey to the stars. But somewhere behind the panels of the service module, damage already existed. A thermostat inside one of the oxygen tanks, meant for 28 volts, had been unknowingly exposed to higher voltage during ground tests, weakening the wiring. When that tank was stirred in flight, the damage would trigger a short. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now, everything felt controlled, clean, calm. As the spacecraft passed beyond the orbit of the Moon, the astronauts prepared for the next phase. The command module was separated from the spent third stage, rotated and docked with the lunar module. This delicate maneuver allowed them to pull the lander free, forming the full Apollo spacecraft as it would fly to the Moon. The first full day in space passed uneventfully. The systems functioned smoothly. The crew performed a live television broadcast, showing viewers how they ate, moved, and worked in microgravity. They floated with ease, smiling as they explained life aboard a spaceship. Most networks didn't air the footage. Spaceflight, once a marvel, had begun to feel familiar. But familiarity is not safety. Just beneath the surface, the quiet floor remained. As night fell across the United States and Apollo 13 moved deeper into space, the stars outside the window glittered with silent indifference. Inside, all was still. The astronauts prepared for sleep, following checklists, drifting between compartments. Outside, Earth grew smaller. The Moon, their destination, loomed ahead. And within the spacecraft, a small spark waited, unseen, unheard, ready. It was the evening of April 13th, 1970. Nearly 56 hours had passed since Apollo 13 lifted off from Earth. The spacecraft was gliding steadily through the blackness, roughly 200,000 miles from home. Inside, the three astronauts moved through routine tasks, unaware that their mission and their lives were about to change. The day had felt calm. The crew had completed a televised broadcast not long before, floating in zero gravity and speaking cheerfully to the cameras. They demonstrated how they lived, how they worked, how they moved through the spacecraft like fish in water. Laughter was easy. Their words were light. Down on Earth, however, many television networks had chosen not to air the segment. Public interest in lunar missions had waned. It all felt familiar now, perhaps even predictable. Then came the routine procedure, a simple command from Mission Control. "Jack, let's give the cryotanks a stir." This was standard, done to prevent the supercooled liquid oxygen from settling into layers within the tank. Swigert flipped the switch without hesitation, and then, in the blink of a moment, everything changed. A loud bang rang through the spacecraft. It was sudden and unmistakable, not the distant creak of thermal stress, not the muted thud of a docking maneuver. This was different, a jolt, a deep metallic sound that made the spacecraft tremble. The lights flickered, warning indicators lit up in rapid succession. Alarm tones echoed through the command module. Swigert's voice came first, composed but laced with tension. "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." Jim Lovell followed, confirming what they all now sensed. "Houston, we've had a problem." It was the kind of phrase that barely hints at the truth beneath it. In those 7 words lay the unraveling of an entire mission. Something had gone terribly wrong. Inside the spacecraft, the crew scrambled to understand what had happened. The control panel was alive with signals. Oxygen tank pressure dropping rapidly. Fuel cells failing. Systems blinking red. Lovell looked out the small window and saw something both beautiful and horrifying. A stream of white vapor venting into space. It twisted and sparkled in the sunlight, curling like smoke in the airless dark. That wasn't exhaust, it was oxygen. Precious, irreplaceable oxygen venting uncontrollably into the void. Mission control in Houston sprang to life. Flight controllers leaned over their consoles, voices overlapping as data flooded in. Readouts didn't make sense. Telemetry was erratic. Systems that had been stable moments ago were now failing. The spacecraft's number 2 oxygen tank, essential for life support and electricity, was empty, and the second was depleting fast. In space, there is no backup oxygen delivery. There is no supply truck, no rescue. Just what you brought with you and what you can salvage. Within minutes, the nature of the mission changed entirely. The moon was no longer a destination. The goal was now clear. Bring them home. The first task was to stabilize the situation. Fred Haise moved into the lunar module to begin checking its systems. Though designed only to land on the moon and return to orbit, it contained its own power supply and life support systems. If Aquarius could be powered up quickly, it could serve as a refuge. Jim Lovell stayed at the helm, coordinating between spacecraft and ground. Swigert handled the command module's rapidly failing systems, flipping switches to preserve what little power remained. Oxygen was almost gone. Water, produced as a byproduct of the fuel cells, had ceased to flow. The cabin grew dry and cold. Back on Earth, the situation was just beginning to reach the public. News anchors interrupted programming with breaking reports. Viewers listened in stunned silence as NASA spokespeople calmly stated that an incident had occurred aboard Apollo 13. There was no panic, just a spreading sense of gravity, of something gone very wrong. In Houston, Gene Kranz took control of the room. His flight controllers were experienced and composed, but this was uncharted territory. No mission had ever experienced a failure of this magnitude so far from Earth. Every second counted. Every assumption had to be questioned. Procedures were rewritten in real time. And yet, amid the chaos, the tone remained steady. There was no shouting, no despair, only quiet focus. Back in space, Aquarius began to awaken. Haise powered up its environmental controls and verified its oxygen stores. It was cramped and cold, designed for 2 men for 2 days. Now it would need to keep 3 men alive for 4 or more. But it had power. It had breathable air. It had become their best chance. The decision was made to shut down Odyssey almost entirely. The command module had to be preserved for re-entry. Its batteries were limited. Its computers were now dormant. It would be dark and cold by the time they returned, but it would have to work again, for without it, they would burn up upon re-entering Earth's atmosphere. As Aquarius took over, the temperature began to fall. Moisture from the astronauts' breath condensed on every surface. Their fingers grew numb, their bodies stiffened, but they were alive. In the hours that followed, hundreds of engineers and support staff on the ground worked to piece together what had happened. The explosion, it was discovered, had likely originated from the number 2 oxygen tank, damaged months earlier during ground testing. A faulty thermostat, overlooked and uncorrected, had triggered the disaster. But blame was not the focus. The mission was not over. The priority now was survival. And so, in the freezing dark, 200,000 miles from home, 3 men drifted through space in a crippled ship. They adjusted. They focused. They planned. They trusted the quiet voices coming through the radio from Earth. Outside, the stars still shone, serene and distant. Inside, the spacecraft hummed softly, with the sound of life hanging on. And though the path ahead was uncertain, the first step had been taken. They had survived the explosion. Now they had to survive the journey home. In the quiet that followed the explosion, time seemed to stretch. There was no gravity to ground them, no sunrises to mark the passing hours. Just the dim lights of a damaged spacecraft and the slow drift of Apollo 13 as it arced through space. The command module, Odyssey, was crippled, its fuel cells dying, its oxygen supply nearly gone. The cabin, once warm and lit, had begun to dim, growing colder by the hour. It was clear now that it could no longer support life. The only option was to move into the lunar module, Aquarius, a spacecraft that had not been designed for such a purpose. Aquarius had been intended for a very different role: to ferry 2 astronauts down to the lunar surface for a few days, support brief scientific exploration, and then lift off again to rejoin the command module. It was never supposed to house 3 people for 4 long days in space. Its walls were thin, its systems delicate, its batteries limited, but it was still intact, and it still had power, oxygen, and life support capabilities. In that moment, it became something else entirely, a lifeboat. Lovell made the decision quickly. If they wanted to survive, they would have to shut down Odyssey and move into Aquarius while there was still time. The transition had to be swift but careful. Every second counted, and every mistake could be fatal. Fred Haise was the first to begin activating the lunar module's systems. He floated through the narrow tunnel, pulling himself hand over hand as he entered the smaller spacecraft. Inside, the air was cool and still. The control panels were dark, the switches untouched since pre-launch testing. Slowly, methodically, he brought the systems online, flipping switches, checking readouts, confirming power levels. One by one, lights blinked to life. Jack Swigert worked to power down the failing systems in Odyssey, following Houston's commands step by step. With oxygen nearly gone, the fuel cells were no longer producing electricity. Every moment they delayed risked draining the last reserves needed for re-entry. The command module had to be preserved, kept dormant like a sleeping machine, ready to be revived in the final hours of the mission. Its guidance systems, computers, lights, and heaters were shut down. As the last systems went dark, the temperature began to drop rapidly. Swigert made his way into Aquarius, joining Haise in the small, cluttered space that would now serve as their home. Lovell remained between the 2 modules, coordinating communications, managing navigation, and ensuring nothing was missed. Through it all, his voice remained calm and composed, the voice of a commander who understood the gravity of the situation, yet refused to yield to fear. When he finally joined the others inside Aquarius, the 3 astronauts floated shoulder to shoulder in a chamber barely large enough to sit upright in. Wires crisscrossed the walls, clipboards and bags drifted beside them. Duct tape and plastic bags formed makeshift storage. It was tight, it was cold, but it was safe, for now. On the ground, NASA engineers scrambled to rewrite procedures in real time. There were no manuals for this, no rehearsed plans for using the lunar module as a full-time survival capsule. Every solution had to be imagined, tested in simulators, and then transmitted across the void of space. Engineers calculated battery reserves, oxygen levels, carbon dioxide buildup, and how long the filters would last. They combed through every system to find where energy could be saved. Heaters were turned off, Lights dimmed. Communications limited. Even the guidance computer was powered down, with Lovell now steering the spacecraft manually. One of the biggest problems came in the form of the carbon dioxide scrubbers. The lunar module's filters weren't designed to handle the needs of 3 people. As carbon dioxide levels crept higher, the danger became clear. Without a solution, they would suffocate. The problem was complicated by the fact that the spare filters from Odyssey didn't fit the system in Aquarius. They were the wrong shape, square filters for a round opening. But ingenuity triumphed. Engineers on the ground devised a workaround using materials the crew had on board: plastic bags, cardboard, a sock, and lots of duct tape. The result was makeshift, almost absurd in appearance, but it worked. With guidance from Houston, the astronauts constructed the device and installed it with care. Within hours, carbon dioxide levels dropped to safe levels. Life inside Aquarius settled into a new rhythm. The astronauts rotated tasks. Haise continued to monitor the lunar module's life support systems. Swigert managed communications and power conservation. Lovell navigated using visual references outside the window, aligning the spacecraft using Earth, the Moon, and the stars. The cabin grew steadily colder. Without heaters, the temperature dropped below freezing. Frost formed on the walls. The astronauts bundled themselves in extra clothing and huddled close, trying to conserve body heat. Their breath fogged the air, and condensation clung to surfaces like mist on glass. The food was limited and unappetizing, mostly rehydrated packets and cold snacks. Water was even more precious. With the fuel cells offline, there was no new water being generated. What they had would have to last the entire trip. Dehydration became a concern. Haise began to experience chills and pain, likely due to a developing urinary tract infection, but there was no medicine, no warmth, no time to rest. He continued working quietly, enduring the discomfort with stoic resolve. Despite the hardship, morale remained steady. The crew leaned on each other. They joked occasionally, shared observations out of the window, and found quiet reassurance in the routines they maintained. The voices from Mission Control, distant yet constant, offered further grounding. The engineers on the ground treated every hour as a new puzzle, guiding the crew through procedures that had never been tested, using tools never meant for this purpose. Outside the window, the moon receded into the darkness. Earth remained distant, still days away. The stars wheeled overhead in complete silence. And within that silence, this fragile tin can lifeboat drifted, alive, determined, and guided by teamwork and trust. Though far from the comforts of Earth, the lunar module had become more than a machine. It was a shelter carved from innovation and necessity, a capsule of courage suspended in the void. And as long as Aquarius held, so too did hope. The moon had always been the destination, solid, silent, and waiting. But now it became something else entirely. No longer a goal, it was a turning point, a pivot in the path, a cold, cratered ally that would lend its gravity to a ship in crisis. As Apollo 13 continued its drift through the void, the damaged spacecraft hurtled ever closer to the moon's dark far side. The plan had changed. There would be no descent, no landing, no history written in lunar dust. Instead, there would be a slingshot, one precise arc around the moon to bend their trajectory back toward Earth. Inside Aquarius, the crew prepared for the maneuver. The spacecraft, though wounded, was still flying. With power reserves conserved and the guidance computer mostly offline, they would have to rely on manual navigation. The descent engine on the lunar module had already proved useful for an earlier correction, but now it would be asked to fire again, this time to fine-tune their course home. A small mistake could mean missing Earth entirely. There were no second chances. The calculations came from Earth, where engineers worked tirelessly in mission control. Hours were spent modeling burn times and thrust values, testing procedures in simulators, and transmitting instructions with the greatest care. On board, Lovell reviewed the instructions, Haise prepared the engine controls, and Swigert monitored the systems. It was a team effort, executed with quiet urgency. But guidance was not simple. The explosion had created a cloud of debris around the spacecraft, ice crystals and fragments of the service module that drifted gently alongside them. These particles reflected sunlight and created the illusion of stars. When Lovell looked out to navigate, he had to distinguish real stars from floating debris. For a moment, even the ancient constellations seemed uncertain. But then he saw it, Earth, rising above the lunar horizon, a pale blue orb framed in black. That was no illusion. It became their fixed point. On the far side of the moon, Apollo 13 lost contact with Earth as expected. Radio silence enveloped the crew. For several long minutes there was no communication, no guidance, no comforting voice from Houston, only the deep stillness of space and the rugged grey surface below. Craters and cliffs passed beneath them, bathed in sunlight that no human eye had ever seen in person before. They became some of the few to witness the moon's hidden face, not as explorers, but as survivors. Then came the burn. Lovell called out the timing. Haise ignited the engine. Swigert watched the instruments. The lunar module shuddered as the descent engine roared to life, its soft growl filling the cabin. They counted aloud, steady, calm, deliberate. 14 seconds. That was all it needed to be. Just 14 seconds of precise thrust to shape their future. And then, silence again. The engine cut off. The shaking stopped. The crew looked at one another in the cold, narrow space. It had felt right. The numbers matched. The trajectory was altered. They were going home. Minutes later, as they emerged from behind the moon, the signal returned. Houston confirmed that the burn had been successful. Cheers broke out in mission control. Not wild celebration, but a quiet wave of relief. The slingshot had worked. The path was set. The moon had given them what they needed, a gravitational boost and a new heading for Earth. Yet the journey ahead was still long. 3 days remained before re-entry. 3 days in a spacecraft growing colder by the hour. 3 days with limited water, limited power, and rising uncertainty. Aquarius was holding, but barely. The batteries were draining. The air was stale. Frost crept along the walls. Condensation collected in floating droplets. Every system had to be monitored. Every amp preserved. In the cold dimness of the cabin, the astronauts moved slowly, wrapped in flight suits and layered clothing. Sleep came in short shifts, if at all. Haise's fever worsened. Swigert remained alert, cycling through checklists. Lovell stayed near the window, watching Earth inch closer. The planet that had once been a shrinking marble behind them was now growing larger with every passing hour. Its colors, blue oceans, white clouds, golden land, shimmered with promise. It was beautiful. It was distant, but it was reachable. They marked the passing of time not by clocks, but by transmissions from Earth. Updates came at regular intervals, voice after voice, relaying new calculations, new instructions, new ideas. Engineers, scientists, and technicians continued working in rotating shifts around the clock. In basements, labs, and offices across NASA, people who had never met the astronauts labored to save them. The spacecraft was in motion, but the rescue was being choreographed from far away. Outside, the stars turned slowly. The moon receded. The void remained quiet and endless, and yet, within that stillness, motion persisted. Apollo 13 was no longer drifting without purpose. It was following a line of careful mathematics, a ribbon of gravity and thrust drawn across the sky. The crew reviewed the next set of instructions, Yet another manual burned to correct their speed and angle of descent. The atmosphere of Earth was unforgiving, too steep, and the spacecraft would burn, too shallow, and it would bounce off the atmosphere like a stone on water, never to return. It was a narrow path, and they would have to follow it perfectly. For now, though, they waited, they floated, they endured. The moon had turned them homeward, the course correction had succeeded. And though the final hurdles still lay ahead, Apollo 13 was no longer lost. It was coming home. As Apollo 13 arced its way back toward Earth, the moon slipped behind them like a receding shore. In its place, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, silent, eternal, and cold. The spacecraft floated through this vastness, not with speed, but with grace. There was no sound in space, only the quiet whisper of machinery and the occasional voice over the radio. The burst of the engine was behind them. The path was set, and now all they could do was wait. Inside the lunar module, Aquarius, time slowed. There was no sunrise to break the darkness, no ticking clock to mark the hours. The spacecraft was not designed for comfort. It had no chairs, no beds, no warmth. Its walls were thin, its space limited, and its systems strained beyond what they were built to endure. Yet for 3 men, it was now home. The cold crept in gradually. Without the heat generated by the command module's systems, the temperature inside Aquarius dropped to near freezing. The walls became slick with condensation. Their breath fogged the air. Moisture collected in glistening beads that floated silently, clinging to equipment and drifting like tiny frozen worlds. The crew layered their clothing, pulling socks over their hands and wrapping themselves in anything they could find. They floated in sleeping bags, huddled shoulder to shoulder, trying to conserve body heat. Fred Haise was growing ill. The limited water supply meant they had to ration fluids, and dehydration began to take its toll. Haise developed a fever and chills, most likely a urinary tract infection, but he never complained. He pressed on, completing checklists, monitoring the life support systems, and responding to Houston with clarity and calm. His breathing grew heavier, but his voice remained steady. Jack Swigert stayed focused on the instruments. He managed the communications, monitored the dwindling battery levels, and double-checked each command from Earth. His was the quiet discipline of routine, finding purpose in procedure, comfort in the known. He moved methodically, rarely speaking unless it was to read back a number or confirm a step. His steadiness helped hold the crew together. Jim Lovell, the commander, carried the weight of navigation. With the guidance computer mostly powered down, he relied on visual cues, tracking Earth through the tiny window, orienting the spacecraft by eye. He was a man who had orbited the moon before, who understood what it meant to trust the sky. He kept his tone calm over the radio, relaying updates to Houston with unwavering clarity. He was exhausted, like the others, but he bore it quietly. Their lives depended on small adjustments, well-timed corrections, and his ability to stay focused. The lunar module had been designed for 2 men to survive for 2 days. Now it carried 3 men for more than 4. Everything was stretched to the limit: oxygen, power, patience. The engineers on the ground worked constantly to find ways to conserve energy. They recommended powering down non-essential systems, reducing communication to short intervals, and dimming the few lights that remained. The cabin grew darker and colder. Still, the spacecraft held. The carbon dioxide filters remained a concern. The homemade adaptation, crafted from duct tape, cardboard, and plastic bags, was working, but barely. The lunar module had not been meant to scrub the air for 3 people. The engineers monitored the levels from Earth, prepared to offer another fix at any moment. Every breath the astronauts took was measured, anticipated, watched from afar. Water was precious. There was barely enough to drink, and certainly none for hygiene. Their mouths grew dry, their lips cracked, and their skin grew clammy in the cold. Meals were sparse and difficult to enjoy. mostly cold, rehydrated food from pouches, eaten in silence and drifting crumbs. Appetite faded with fatigue. Still, they kept eating, knowing they would need the strength later. Sleep was fleeting. The chill, the noise of fans, the stiff muscles, none of it lent itself to rest. When they did manage to close their eyes, it was in short bursts, their bodies curled in awkward positions, floating in midair, tethered by straps and hope. They woke with cramps and stiffness, but also with determination. There was no time for despair. Each hour brought a new challenge. Condensation continued to build, threatening short circuits. The astronauts used towels and rags to wipe down the controls, watching droplets dance away. The command module, shut down and dormant, grew even colder. It waited silently, dark, lifeless, and essential. One day soon, they would have to power it back up, and it would need to work perfectly. Outside, Earth grew closer. Once a distant marble, it was now a slowly growing disk of blue and white. They could make out the curve of continents beneath the clouds. Home was no longer a memory. It was a destination, but reaching it would require one final act of precision. There was still the matter of re-entry. The angle had to be perfect. Too steep, and they would burn in the atmosphere. Too shallow, and they would skip off the surface like a stone on a pond, lost to space forever. A final burn would be required to adjust their trajectory, performed manually once again, using a wristwatch for timing, a checklist for guidance, and Earth itself as their visual cue. But that step was still ahead. For now, the crew floated in darkness, wrapped in silence, counting the hours as the ship creaked and the stars glowed softly beyond the frost-covered glass. They spoke rarely, saving energy, saving breath, but they remained united. Every whispered word from Earth, every small success, every hour passed without failure, all of it was progress. In Houston, the team worked without rest. Engineers updated checklists, prepared for power-up procedures, and calculated re-entry parameters. They watched the data pour in, their eyes fixed on glowing screens, their thoughts fixed on the three men in the dark. Day turned to night and back again, but in space it was always night, cold, quiet, and infinite. And yet, through that night, Apollo 13 sailed onward, braving cold, exhaustion, and the limits of endurance, carrying the flicker of human courage across 1,000,000 miles of space. By the fourth day in space, Apollo 13 had become a drifting cocoon of ice, metal, and fading warmth. Inside the lunar module Aquarius, the air was damp and cold, but it was still breathable. The systems were fragile, but they still worked. And beyond the frost-covered windows, Earth now hung large and luminous, filling more of the view with each hour that passed. Home was no longer an idea. It was becoming a shape, a color, a certainty. But returning to Earth required one last challenge, perhaps the most delicate of all. The command module, Odyssey, which had been shut down and left to freeze, would need to be reawakened. It had slumbered in silence for days, its systems dormant, its instruments dark. No spacecraft had ever been powered down and restarted in space like this before. The engineers on Earth had spent long hours creating a new power-up procedure, balancing energy consumption against the command module's depleted battery supply. There was no margin for error. If they used too much power too quickly, they risked triggering a system failure or draining the batteries entirely. If they missed a single switch or sequence, re-entry could be impossible. In the early hours of April 17th, the plan was ready. Lovell, Swigert, and Haise gathered in the narrow tunnel between the two modules. They moved slowly, stiff from cold and fatigue, their movements rehearsed but cautious. With checklists in hand, they floated back into Odyssey for the first time in days. The cabin greeted them with silence. Its walls were crusted with ice. Every surface was damp. The seats, once warm with activity, were now chilled and lifeless. The reactivation began one switch at a time. Power was routed carefully. Lights flickered and came to life. Indicators blinked slowly. Instruments began to respond. It was like reviving a slumbering animal, fragile and unsure, but stirring. Swigert took the lead, guiding each step as outlined by mission control. He moved deliberately, calling out each command, confirming each reading. Lovell monitored navigation systems. Haise supported communications and managed equipment transfers between the two spacecraft. Slowly, Odyssey began to hum. The guidance platform realigned. The navigation computer reactivated. The capsule's life support systems came online. Even the heaters warmed the cabin slightly, though moisture still clung to every surface. The spacecraft, against all odds, was alive again, but power remained scarce. The lunar module's batteries were nearly depleted. So were the command module's reserves. Engineers had devised a way to recharge Odyssey's batteries by siphoning what little power remained in Aquarius, transferring it like the last sips of water from one canteen to another. It was a delicate process, but it worked. The numbers held steady. They had just enough to reach the end. The astronauts took turns preparing for re-entry. They sorted checklists, secured loose objects, tested communications. They reviewed procedures over and over, anchoring each step in muscle memory. The moment of re-entry would come fast. There would be no time for hesitation. Odyssey had to work. The parachutes had to deploy. The heat shield had to hold. It was the final gauntlet. And then came the moment of separation. The service module, which had carried the main engine fuel and oxygen tanks, had to be jettisoned. It was no longer needed. More than that, it was damaged, scarred by the explosion that had nearly cost them everything. As the clamps released, the module drifted away, revealing for the first time the extent of the destruction. The panel had been blown clean off. The interior was exposed to space. Wires, insulation, and twisted metal spilled into the void. The image, transmitted back to Earth, confirmed what many had feared. The damage had been catastrophic. And yet, they had survived. Next, the lunar module, Aquarius, had to be let go. It had served far beyond its design. It had kept them alive. It had carried them home. But it could not survive re-entry. Lovell, Haise, and Swigert gathered in the tunnel one last time. They looked around the cramped, frost-covered interior. Then, with a final command, they detached the module and watched it drift silently away. The lifeboat was gone. Now only Odyssey remained. Inside the capsule, the three astronauts strapped themselves into their seats. They adjusted harnesses, checked helmets, and took one last look at the view beyond the window. Earth loomed large, bright, blue, and cloud-streaked. The planet spun slowly, serene and familiar. It felt close, yet still unreachable. Re-entry would begin soon. It would be fast, hot, and unforgiving. As the spacecraft struck the edge of Earth's atmosphere, friction would ignite the air around it. Plasma would bloom across the heat shield in streaks of orange and gold. The astronauts would feel the sudden pull of gravity, the weight of their bodies pressing into their seats after days of weightlessness. They would not be able to see the flames outside, but they would feel the vibrations, the roar, the strain, and then, the most harrowing moment, radio blackout. As the capsule plunged through the upper atmosphere, the ionized gases would cut off all communications. For several minutes, there would be no contact, no telemetry, no reassurance, just silence. On Earth, mission control would wait. Families would wait. The world would hold its breath. Inside the capsule, there was no more to be done. The systems were ready. The parachutes were packed. The heat shield was in place. All they could do now was trust in the ship, in the work done by thousands of unseen hands, and in each other. The command module that had once slept like a tomb was now awake. Lights flickered, circuits glowed. The faint hiss of oxygen filled the cabin. Earth beckoned. Lovell looked out one final time. Swigert adjusted a dial. Haise shifted in his seat, quiet and still. The journey was almost over. The Earth had never seemed so vast or so close. Its curve filled the window, wrapped in swirling clouds and glowing blues, a planet alive with motion and light. As Apollo 13 approached the upper atmosphere, the spacecraft arced gently downward, tracing the narrow corridor that would carry it through fire and home again. Inside the command module, Lovell, Swigert, and Haise sat strapped into their seats, secured in silence, their eyes fixed forward and their hands resting on final checklists. There was nothing more to adjust, no more switches to flip. The moment had come. Outside, space was still. The blackness gave way to a faint shimmer as molecules in the high atmosphere began to interact with the heat shield. Then came the fire. At 25,000 miles per hour, the command module struck Earth's invisible veil. Air, compressed to plasma, erupted around it in blazing waves. Flames licked the capsule's surface, unseen from inside but felt in every vibration, every tremble of the frame. The craft shuddered as it decelerated rapidly, its nose cone glowing with heat. Inside, the cabin was lit by only a few instruments. There was no view of the inferno beyond, only the deep pull of gravity returning, pressing their bodies into their seats. After days of weightlessness, the pressure was foreign, intense. Muscles ached, limbs stiffened. Still, they remained composed, focused, calm. Then, as expected, came the silence. At the peak of re-entry, the ionized gases enveloping the spacecraft blocked all communications with Earth. It was a known blackout, an unavoidable curtain drawn across the sky. But this time it felt heavier, longer. The world was watching. Mission Control stared at blank screens. Telemetry ceased. Voices stopped. All they could do was wait. In that silence, time felt suspended. 3 minutes passed, then 4. The flight controllers whispered among themselves, glancing at the clock. Families watching at home gripped their chairs. Newscasters paused, unsure of what to say. The seconds stretched into minutes, 5 minutes, and still nothing. Inside the capsule, the crew felt every creak, every groan of the capsule's descent. The heat shield did its work, burning away layer by layer, deflecting the fiery energy back into the sky. The cabin held. The systems remained stable. 6 minutes. And then, faint at first, a voice crackled through the static. "Odyssey, this is Houston. Do you read?" The room erupted. Applause broke out in Mission Control. Smiles turned to tears. Engineers hugged. After the longest radio blackout in Apollo history, the crew had emerged from the fire. The spacecraft was intact. The parachutes had deployed. Far above the Pacific Ocean, 3 red and white canopies bloomed in the sky. The command module drifted downward. Its fall slowed to a gentle glide. Below, the USS Iwo Jima steamed into position, its crew scanning the skies. Through clouds and sunlight, the capsule descended, rocking gently in the breeze. At 1:07 p.m. Eastern Time, on April 17, 1970, Apollo 13 splashed down into the sea. The impact was firm but survivable. Waves broke around the floating capsule. The parachutes fell away into the water. The command module bobbed upright, its beacon blinking. Rescue teams raced to the site in helicopters and inflatable boats. Within minutes, the hatch was opened. First Swigert, then Haise, then Lovell emerged, pale and tired, but smiling. They were carried to safety, wrapped in blankets, and checked by flight surgeons. Cheers filled the air. The impossible journey was over. Around the world, televisions played the images in slow motion. The parachutes unfurling, the splashdown, the smiling faces of the astronauts waving from the deck of the ship. The mission had failed in its original goal, but succeeded in something far greater. Survival against the odds. ingenuity in the face of disaster, and unity across thousands of people working together. Back in Houston, the flight controllers gathered in quiet reflection. Gene Kranz, the flight director whose calm voice had guided them through every crisis, removed his vest and exhaled deeply. It was done. The story of Apollo 13 would be remembered not for what went wrong, but for how humanity responded. A spacecraft damaged beyond its ability to function. A crew stranded 250,000 miles from home. And yet, through teamwork, skill, and calm under pressure, they returned safely. That evening, the astronauts looked out across the sea from the deck of the ship. The horizon stretched wide. The sky above was deep and cloudless. Stars began to appear, one by one, no longer distant and unreachable, but familiar, like old friends. The earth, so large and solid beneath their feet, felt like a miracle, and so ended a journey that nearly didn't, but did. The days that followed were filled with questions, press conferences, debriefings, ceremonies. Lovell, Haise, and Swigert appeared in front of microphones, smiling beneath their fatigue, answering questions with humility. There were no boasts, no dramatics, just gratitude. They spoke of teamwork, of calm heads, of small steps taken carefully in the dark. The true story, they insisted, was not about them, but about the people who brought them home. In the weeks ahead, awards were given, streets were renamed. The Presidential Medal of Freedom was presented to the Apollo 13 crew and to the entire mission control team. But even as the world celebrated, NASA turned inward. Investigations began. Engineers pored over systems. The oxygen tank that had caused the explosion was traced to a fault during manufacturing, exacerbated by ground tests that had unknowingly damaged internal wiring. Changes were made, protocols were revised, and slowly, Apollo 14 took shape. Yet Apollo 13 had shifted something deeper. It was supposed to be a mission to the moon. It became a mission about Earth, about how fragile and brilliant human beings could be. The public, once growing weary of lunar missions, rediscovered their awe. Schoolchildren began writing essays not just about astronauts, but about engineers and scientists. The space program was no longer just about glory, it was about grit. In books, lectures, and eventually film, the story of Apollo 13 would be told again and again. It became a blueprint for leadership under pressure, for resilience without bravado, for quiet excellence. Gene Kranz's mantra, "Failure is not an option," entered the cultural lexicon. Jim Lovell, though he never returned to space, remained a symbol of calm command. Haise and Swigert went on to different paths, one to test flights, the other to public service, but both remained deeply connected to the memory of that shared voyage. Beyond the names and events, though, Apollo 13's legacy lived on in something less tangible. The sense that even when everything goes wrong, humanity can still come together to make it right. In a damaged spacecraft hurtling through darkness, a million things could have spelled the end. But what prevailed was focus, collaboration, the quiet strength of people doing their jobs with care, guided by reason and steadied by hope. In classrooms around the world, the story of Apollo 13 became more than a history lesson. It became a meditation on teamwork, on preparation, on trust. In the years to come, NASA would return to space again and again. But it was this mission, the mission that didn't land on the moon, that many astronauts cited as their greatest teacher. And for the world beyond science and spaceflight, Apollo 13 offered something else, a reminder that sometimes the most profound journeys are not the ones that reach their destination, but the ones that survive the storm. That success is not always triumph, but perseverance. As night falls over the ocean where Odyssey once splashed down, the stars still shimmer overhead. They twinkle quietly, as they always have, distant and unreachable. But we, the watchers, the dreamers, know something now. We know that even when the lights go out and the way home seems lost, there are hands to guide us, minds to solve the problems, voices to calm the storm. And somewhere, in the hush of night, a spacecraft drifts gently back through memory, 3 souls wrapped in silence, watching the curve of Earth grow larger, brighter, closer. They made it home, and in doing so, they brought all of us just a little closer to one another. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey through time and space, please consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss our next gentle voyage into history. Your support helps to run these videos ad-free so that you can drift freely, uninterrupted. Every video we make is a chance to slow down, reflect, and discover the incredible stories that shape our world. Wherever you are, thank you for listening, and until next time, sleep well.